Elspeth was accustomed to being stared at. She was equally familiar with being barraged by odd questions and desperate prayers. The sight of an archangel had a habit of inspiring such things, but she wasn't used to seeing a small child clinging to her wings and asking, "Are you a dragon?" She blinked lambent eyes at the round and unfrightened face peering up at her. A dragon? "You have wings," started the child, as somewhere in the distance a woman let out a scandalized yelp, the mother, presumably, and Elspeth took absent note of the fact that no one else on the skyship had come to interrogate her about her presence. Not after she explained to a flustered dignitary that she was here to see Narset, please, and was cordially told to make herself at home until the Waymaster could be retrieved. Whatever else Narset's people, the Jeskai, supplied a memory, were, they were at least polite. "And you have 4 other limbs," the child continued. There was something fussy about the way she spoke the phrase, like someone being coerced into allowing use of their best crockware and now watching vigilantly to prevent damage. "That means you're a dragon." Elspeth considered this. "Does it?" The child nodded. The accusation made a kind of tilted sense. Elspeth had heard stories of how alien the dragons of Tarkir were, how variable in form they'd become, and perhaps it was just simpler for the parents on this plane to caution their offspring that everything with 4 limbs and 2 wings has to be a dragon, like a blanket warning to keep children from investigating strange noises in the dark. Except there was a real fear in the woman's face as she came racing up to Elspeth, hands clutching for her daughter's shoulders. "My apologies," she said, imposing herself between Elspeth and the child. The latter herded behind the woman despite her loud protestations. "Mama, I want to talk to the dragon lady." "My daughter hasn't learned her manners yet. Please don't take anything she says as an offense." Elspeth stretched out a mailed hand and was faintly surprised when the woman cowered away. In her previous life, she might have laughed or tried harder to reassure the pair, but since her ascendance, however, every impulse felt muted, insignificant, dwarfed by an instinct toward doing what was right. And what was right for the woman was giving her the mercy of distance. It was clear all she wanted was to get away from Elspeth, to run as far as the ship would permit her. No offense was taken. Elspeth folded her wings tight against her back and dipped her chin, hoping the woman would find some comfort in her cool formality. "May you go with the blessings of what gods you worship." That earned the archangel an odd look. The woman flashed her an uncertain smile before she spooned her daughter up into a one-armed embrace and draped her over the shoulder like a sack of rice, backing away from Elspeth when she was certain the girl was secure. 4 strides into her retreat, the woman turned and broke into a trot, and the archangel could hear them arguing as they went away. "But the dragon lady, Mama! For the last time, she's not a dragon!" "If she's not a dragon," howled the child triumphantly, having caught her mother with indomitable logic, "why can't I talk to her?" "Because I could be wrong!" Their voices died in the background chatter. The pearly light emitting from Elspeth was chillier in hue than the glow from the trails of lanterns suspended in the air. They bobbed with the wind, untethered to anything, and finally alone, Elspeth stood and studied the skyship. It might have been a temple once, or even a series of them, at least before a disaster struck. Whatever had happened wasn't enough to deter the Jeskai from making use of the ruins. Roofed structures, the curved eaves, sky blue and ornamented with gold, striated in places with cracks or signs of repair, were carefully stacked along the bow of the massive vessel. At their summit hung a massive beacon the color of cinnabar. There were monks everywhere, some laden with scrolls, others traversing the topsails, attending to the rigging, swabbing the deck. They moved with a practiced acrobatic efficiency, and even as she was now, displaced from mortal concerns, Elspeth found them a pleasure to witness. "Elspeth Tyrrell," came a voice from behind her. "We have never met, but I know you by reputation, just as you know me by the same. It is a pleasure to finally meet you. We shared many friends in common." She turned to see a woman enrobed in the same blue and white palette as the monks, only her garments were more elaborate and embellished. Her expression was calm, but otherwise inscrutable. Her smile, perfunctory. "I am Narset, Waymaster of the Jeskai, and I believe you were seeking me." Elspeth did not waste any time on empty courtesies. "Dragonstorms have begun appearing throughout the multiverse. I have come to ask how Tarkir has kept them at bay." Narset's expression adjusted to one of faint concern. "I'm afraid you might have come for nothing then," said Narset, already moving to the cabin. "Please, follow me to my study. We need to consolidate our knowledge of the Dragonstorms. I have a suspicion things are far worse than either of us could have imagined." Though Narset knew the Jeskai conventions of hospitality, she was unsure about the correct protocol when one's guest was an archangel. Elspeth, as far as Narset was aware, hadn't always been a celestial being. She'd been human once, although from all accounts she possessed the same rigorous values that she had now. With a pang, Narset thought again of Ajani and how fond he'd been of Elspeth, of her devotion to what was right, her compassion and her commitment to defending those who could not do so themselves. She thought of Tamio and her story circle, the moonfolk woman's appetite for learning everything, no matter how trivial the anecdote. She was the first one to speak of Elspeth and her courage. Narset hoped that her friends, because what else do you call people you'd sit around and share stories with, listen to for hours, drinking up every tale they offered, were well. Since her spark guttered out, she could no longer walk the blind eternities, something that had felt like a loss at first, and then a relief. She had justification now to think of Tarkir, and only of Tarkir, to put all of herself into the work of rehabilitating her ravaged home. Nonetheless, she missed them, those other planeswalkers, those rare few who understood what it was like to not entirely belong, to long for more than flesh and tradition could ever aspire to. Tamio would have been glad at our meeting here, said Elspeth. The light from her was like something of a dying candle. Yeah, she would have, said Narset, surprised at how raw her voice was. And to Johnny, too. It cost everything to bring him and Nissa back. The life of a woman, the spark from a living planeswalker, and the spark of a dead one. Johnny, I think sometimes he'd have preferred... The words died in her throat. At his heart, said Narset slowly, the silence barbed with hurt. If either of them were careless, they'd cut themselves open on the past. He only ever wanted peace. Yes. An awkward quiet settled over them, heavy as bloodied silk, the two separated by the island of Narset's desk. She had protested its grandeur, saying she needed nothing but space enough for her inkpots and scrolls, textbooks and untranslated volumes. But the other stewards insisted. The Jeskai needed a new symbol, and as Waymaster, it was her duty to serve. As such, she required the right trappings, and that began with a sufficiently officious-looking desk. Earlier, you said things might be worse than either of us could have imagined. The Dragonstorms and Tarkir have become considerably more potent, said Narset, glad for the change of topic. Grief was so complicated to navigate. She knew farmers who disdained sympathy and preferred a no-nonsense delivery of bad news, but also warriors as fragile as blown glass who wept like children when told a loved one had passed. Narset couldn't tell where Elspeth fell on that spectrum. Worse, she was sure the Archangel would look askance at the Jeskai's apathy toward any concept of an afterlife. Then again, she might not. Johnny had said, no. Narset shook her head. Focus, she reminded herself, trying not to think of how she'd had to learn secondhand of Ajani's arrival in Tarkir, and of how many days she'd spent waiting for the Leonin warrior to reach out and reconnect. Had he thought her callous because of this? Had she failed him? So much so, they've begun to reshape Tarkir itself. Narset removed a map from its scroll case and unfurled it across the desk. The parchment was mottled with annotations, notes she'd made across recent months. Some places have seen elevated water levels, others sinkholes, even new geological formations. That unto itself would be concerning, as it has worrying ramifications for local ecosystems. But if you look here, here, and here... Narset pointed to 3 spots on the map, each heavily circled in ink. Our Mardu contacts say there are places in the steppes that have begun to grow scales. Scales? As in the land itself? No, nothing is coming alive. Narset thought on this for a moment. Yet... Although, according to reports, there are now oxen with reptilian eyes and cats growing wings. I don't know how much of this is apocryphal, but one thing is for certain. There are primordial forces in play here. It's something as powerful as Ugin. Except Ugin is gone, said Elspeth. Narset nodded. And Bolus is dead. In theory, it's possible this could be the work of some other elder dragon of their level, but Ugin believes all his kin to be dead. She drew a thin breath. It has something to do with Ugin's departure, I'm sure of it. His presence catalyzed, if not outright created, these original storms. However, according to all of our records, they never exceeded a certain intensity until he was incapacitated. Therefore, it stands to reason that he served as a metaphysical ballast somehow, keeping the plane in check. She caught herself, staunched the torrent of words with a swallowed noise of frustration. Elspeth had asked for none of Narset's theorizing, and so she wouldn't subject her guest to such. This was decorum, or at least that's what Narset had been told. Either way, said Narset, smoothing her voice into nonchalance, the Dragonstorms would be manageable problems if not for the fact they have been producing more dragons, each of them larger, stronger, and hungrier than the last. We had learned how to fight the old broods, but these new dragons defy everything we knew. What if the solution lies in the ritual you used? Said Elspeth. It is possible that all we need to do is modify... I can't, said Narset, voice fraying. I won't. You don't understand. The ritual... She had to keep her explanation of what had transpired in Tarkir and her role in the revolution as bare-boned as possible, half because Narset was sick to death of hearing her own peons, and half because there was grief enough at the table without her adding more. A small, childish part of her had worried they'd break under the weight of it all, but perhaps she should have elaborated. It'd have made this part easier. The ritual, repeated Narset. It did more than summon the spirit dragons. How to put into words what she herself barely comprehended. It seemed gauche, irresponsible somehow. As best as I can understand it, it may have destabilized the delicate balance in Tarkir, resulting in a chain reaction. And you're afraid that history would repeat itself if you were to provide assistance. Always that same affectless calm. Correct. It'd be different if I had Ojutai. The past and its thrice-damned thorns. Narset flinched at how easily she invoked the Dragon Lord, for all that he was an anathema to the Jeskai these days. Luckily, Elspeth's face remained vacant of any judgment. Then again, it seemed to carry no expression at all, save for a calm like cold steel. Tarkir suffers, but the plane is at least familiar with the forces at work here. The clans have their contingencies, their defenses. I don't want to think about what's happening elsewhere, in a world where very different rules and no way of protecting itself if the worst happens. Narset shook her head. There are too many possibilities, none of which are good, and Whatever else she might have said was eaten up by a loud, splintering noise of a crash and a low, urgent knelling, a warning that something was amiss. Elspeth and Narset jolted to their feet, even as shouting boiled through the walls, a woman's high, desperate wail shearing through the clamor. "What's happening?" said Elspeth, serene as before, though her hand was already on the hilt of her blade. Narset cocked her head, listening to the bells, their cadence. She knew their vocabulary, but she hadn't heard this message before. This was new. This was something the monastery hadn't experienced, a disaster they'd anticipated, but only knew on paper. The bells rang out again. "Dragon," said Narset, already running out of the study. "There's a wild dragon inside the school." There had been attacks in the past, of course. The wild dragons, out of hunger or a playful malice, would occasionally test the Jeskai defenses, but those had been desultory, half-hearted efforts quickly deterred. The remnants of Ojutai's brood were more vicious, but even they were driven away. Never had a wild dragon even made it into the deck of that ship. The Skyriders and their mounts made sure of that. But there was one here now. And not only was it on the ship, it was inside the school. Fear shuddered through Narset. The fact it was night was her only consolation. The youngest pupils had only lessons during the day to allow them time with their families and their friends. Scholarly pursuits were important, but it was equally vital they grew as people, and that involved them building actual relationships with the world. It was the older children who would be in class then, the ones both driven enough and talented enough to volunteer for electives. Narset knew their curriculum well. They wouldn't immediately become fodder. Except immediately wasn't good enough. There was still a dragon inside with them, one that had somehow bypassed every protective measure. If it could do that, it could... Narset crushed the rest of the thought down. No point in speculation, no reason to do anything but get there and assess the damage. She needed to triage the situation, ascertain what they could do, determine how many were already dead. The teachers all possessed an infallible courage. The dragon would have to go through them to get to the children, and because of that, Narset knew there'd be casualties. The only question was how many. Behind her, Elspeth's light splashed the corridor in pale shadows, the angel keeping abreast as Narset ran. Around them, monks were either herding frightened children and civilians away from the danger, or charging down to the attacker themselves. Narset couldn't help the frisson of pride that ran through her. They were good people, humble in peace, exquisite in crisis, and Narset had known many who were the reverse, who would brag unceasingly and then falter at the sight of adversity. Not the monks of Storm Crane, though. They had proved their mettle before, and were proving it again. Narset and Elspeth turned another corner. The school laid in the belly of the ship like a seed dreaming of a better future. There'd been months of heated argument preceding its construction. Some had voted for it to be in the topmost levels of the towers where the students would have an unrestricted view of the world around them, while others tartly insisted that was suicide, suggesting instead they best hide the school where there'd be layers of defenses and 100 exit routes. Narset was eternally grateful the latter won, especially now as the ship bucked and heaved with the continued onslaught. More monks streamed past, the wounded cradled in their arms, debris slicking them with gray dust. Narset brushed her fingers along each of them, instilling them with a little more speed, a little more endurance. Hardly the most impressive work of magic, but there was no time for anything else. In the near distance, something broke under the repeated assault, and the ship seemed to bellow in agony. In the distance, screams. Narset's heart lurched. "Almost," she breathed, a prayer cradled in the word. The two descended one last cascade of stairs. Suddenly, she and Elspeth were face to face with the ship's attacker. Narset realized immediately how the dragon had evaded their defenses and the fatal mistake in their planning. The door beneath the creature gaped into the open sky. It had gored its way out through the ship's hull, chewed its way through wood and metal. The hallway was almost too small for the interloper, a leviathan like a chunk of ice carved from a glacier, all teeth and vicious, sinuous motion. It was so big, only its head, throat, and a single paw were fully inside the ship. There was something almost comical about the sight, but Narset didn't feel like laughing, not with the dragon's gore-scummed mouth, the lifeless arm jutting between its teeth, and the limp palm held out like its owner could still be saved. Beside her, Elspeth drew her sword with a silken whisper of iron. The dragon took no notice of the sound or the monks bracketing its enormous form. Its attention was solely on a chamber recently collapsed, the door stoved in like ribs. Through the wreckage, Narset could see just about 5 youths holding one another, and a determined face of a 6th standing at the ruins of the entrance, her hands held out. The faintest silvering of the air told Narset the girl had thrown up a barrier between her and the encroaching behemoth. That won't hold for long, Elspeth, terse, inhumanly calm. No, said Narset, it won't. The dragon's hide was stippled with wounds and filmed with a fine sheet of blood. Narset's monks had done what they could, however, it was too well armored, and their weapons only had so much reach. The dragon drew a gulping breath, then another, throat working furiously as though it was trying to dislodge a bone. The temperature plummeted. When Narset next spoke, her breath was white in the air. Do you trust me? Elspeth did not reply, only unfurled her wings, rising into the air. She was brighter than any star, beautiful as legend, and Narset understood then why the faithful of those other planes would follow their angels into the mouth of hell. She lifted her radiant sword, looking for all the world like a weapon herself. On my mark, I need you to dive for its throat and cut deep. Narset had no idea how well an angel could survive a dragon's digestive tract or a point-blank blast of ice, but of all of them, Elspeth stood the best chance of doing what must be done. The dragon's mouth was still red gum and slick flesh, its throat still meat. The angel glanced at Narset, expression unchanged, and briefly, the Jeskai woman regretted never knowing Elspeth in her first life. The incorruptible figure whom the heavens clawed out of the grave to be its champion. Just say when. The dragon inhaled. Inside the well of its throat, Narset saw billowing steam as the cold turned the air heavy. She gestured for the arrayed monks to fall back, stared unblinkingly at their radiance until her eyes watered. They'd only have one chance. Too soon, and they risked truly testing the constitution of the angelic being. Too late, and, well, Narset wouldn't think about that yet either. Time slowed to honey. Now! Elspeth dove headfirst into the open maw, sword held out like a beacon. Narset saw it cut, and she saw it cut deep, piercing the roof of the dragon's mouth. She gestured to the monks with a hand. Now! Gore erupted in a soupy curtain, drenching the angel, splattering the bright silver of her armor in a violent red. Narset rushed toward the 5 of the monks, prying the rubble apart, another 3 raising shields as they worked. The dragon reared back, head whipping to the right, bringing a wall crashing. Narset felt the air reverberate with the impact, but the shields held. It tried to bring its teeth down on Elspeth, but that only drove her sword deeper into its skull. The creature's roar became a shriek as the angel pushed her blade up, as high as it could go, until it was hilt deep in mucus-sheened tissue. The children were passed between monks and sent hurrying down a corridor. 2, 3, 4. Narset counted under her breath as every child vanished from sight. 6. The angel and her adversary were at an impasse, neither able to escape the threat of the other. But with their wards safely evacuated, the monks of Stormcrane Monastery no longer had to be cautious. In unison, they took arms again. Those without weapons now lifting hands ablaze with light. Elspeth had given them an opening. Foam bubbled through the dragon's maw. The dragon took another breath and gagged as Elspeth torqued her powerful frame in a half circle, slicing a flap of muscle from its mouth. The monks struck as the dragon screamed, steel and fists pulverizing soft tissue, shattering teeth, and turning the insides of its jaw into a slaughterhouse. And that was enough for the creature. It began to writhe back, struggling to escape its attackers. Every hungry thought replaced by a need to flee. Mouth lolling wide enough for Elspeth to step back out. It fixed Narset with a baleful stare before slithering down, and by the sound of it, up. It's returning to the deck, said Elspeth. Narset could still feel her pulse hammering in her throat as she stared up at the Archangel. Elspeth was a red effigy, her hair matted with blood. Even the glow of her wings was transformed. No longer that brilliant gold, but a ruddy light. What could be seen of her expression remained eerily tranquil. Omens. Written by Cassandra Khaw for MTGstory.com. Produced and narrated by Taylor McMahon.